The mind and the heart of the Kenyan man. The mind and the heart of the Kenyan man is basically the mind of a slave. The culture of Kenya is a slave culture. And I'm not just saying this for the sake of sounding dramatic. If you do a sociological study of the slave societies that existed in the past, you'll discover that those societies had a dichotomy. They had the culture of the masters, and they had the culture that developed amongst the slaves. So when you examine critically the culture of the slaves, and then you examine the culture of Kenya today, you'll discover that those two cultures are the same. And we want to focus on the male, because in this situation, it is the male that determines what we are talking about. So when you look at the culture of the male slaves in slave societies, that is the exact same culture that we have in Kenya amongst Kenyan males. So anytime you find yourself living in a slave society, certain values are predominant in those slave societies. In the case of Kenya, for the males, there's certain coded behavior that is expected of you. And there's other behaviors that are immediately condemned, ostracized, and not acceptable. Now we want to look at these behaviors and show you that the underlying culture is really, and the values are really slave values, which may account for some of the things that happen in Kenya. So what are the values of a slave society? The highest prized value in such a society is docility. You must be docile. You must be meek. All sympathy, empathy, kindness, and love can only and must only be displayed towards the master. All aggression, violence, hatred, opposition, rebellion can and must only be shown towards your fellow slaves. And so in the case of Kenya, it's very obvious that you have to love the foreigner, you have to worship the foreigner. People go into temples and literally worship statues and cartoon paintings of foreigners as God. You must always be smiling towards the foreigner. And anytime you see a Kenyan man with a foreigner, the Kenyan man is always smiling, always acting weak, always unajua kujikunja, compressing his body so that he doesn't appear aggressive. And it doesn't matter what other role this man plays in society. It doesn't matter. He could be a military general, he could be a doctor, he could be anything. But the minute he encounters a foreigner, he immediately becomes like a juvenile. Immediately, the behavior changes just like that. He stops being this big, strong man who's a doctor, who's the head of a hospital, who's the head of a government department, who's an ambassador, who's a cabinet minister, who's whatever role he's doing. And immediately, his behavior changes. He becomes a shy 12-year-old boy. Immediately. On the presence of the foreigner. Why? Because this is a slave culture. And so African men within this culture are expected to act like shy juveniles or to act like women in the presence of foreigners. So, according to the slave code, you have to smile at the foreigner. So the African man in Kenya smiles at the foreigner all the time. You'll never see an African man showing a tough face towards any foreigner, because that is ostracized. The other thing, you have to show sympathy to the masters. So the foreigner in this case is the master, right? He's the object of adoration and worship. And so the African man in Kenya shows empathy, great empathy towards the foreigner. If something happens to a foreigner who represents the master, right? The African man, the Kenyan man, always shows empathy and goes out of his way to help this foreigner. Okay? So the foreigner can basically do anything in Kenya without any challenge from the Kenyan man. Now, the other thing about the slave code, the coded slave behavior, is that you must always be kind to the master. And so the Kenyan man is extremely kind to the master. Always, even when the master breaks the law, he's treated with extreme kindness. Even when he's a criminal who has raped children, he is treated with extreme kindness. Even when taken in front of a judge, the judge follows the slave code and gives the minimum sentence possible. Because under the slave code, you are not allowed to be anything other than kind and empathetic and sympathetic towards your master. And the foreigner in this case is the master. The other value that is highly regarded in slave society is what we can term as meekness. You must always be meek, which translates in normal society, meekness amongst men translates into what can be called a lack of courage or cowardice. So that anytime a Kenyan man encounters a foreigner who is the master, the Kenyan man is very meek. Even if he has 5 wives and growls like a lion in his house, the minute he encounters a foreigner who may be 20 years younger than him, immediately he becomes a shy 12-year-old boy. His behavior transforms from being typical male behavior into what is typical female behavior. This is part of the slave code. So these are the rules that African men in Kenya are supposed to live by. And if you try to move away from this kind of behavior, the rest of the Kenyan men will immediately condemn you, because you're not following the rules that are expected of you in a slave society. The other rule is that you must never raise your voice towards the master. You must never show anger towards the master. And so the Kenyan man never ever raises his voice against the master. And the master is the foreigner. Any foreigner, I don't care. If the foreigner is a descendant of the Nephilim, that's the foreigner we mean. We mean the foreigner whose this side looks exactly like this side. Those are the children of the Nephilim. So those are the foreigners that we are talking about. So the Kenyan man can never raise his voice, and especially never his fist, against the master, who is any foreigner that shows up in Kenya. And you've seen this example again and again and again. I'm not exaggerating. Do you remember that story of that? There was a watchman who was being beaten up by a Mzungu. Do you remember? Did you see the video? Yeah, he was beaten up thoroughly. And what was peculiar was that this watchman is way stronger than this Mzungu. And what was also strange, if you saw that video, what was very strange is that this African man never raised his fist even once to even defend himself. Forget about raising his fist to beat up the Mzungu. He did not even raise his fist to defend himself. He was beaten up like a toddler. And you could just see the mentality of the slave. And this is by no means unique to Kenyan men. It's not only Kenyan men who are cowards. African men in general, are great cowards. They are famous across the world for their cowardice. And I remember I saw this video. It was coming from India. It was a Nigerian guy. And he was being beaten by, I think, 2 Indians. And this was a big guy. This was a big Nigerian guy. They're very, very well fed. And these were 2 puny Indians beating him up. And it was shocking that they were able to beat him up. He never defended himself. He behaved exactly the way a woman behaves. He did not seek to defend himself. He kept on calling for a Mzungu to save him. That video is still He's still online. He kept on calling for Mzungu to save him. I'm serious, I'm not exaggerating. He never defended himself. So you see this pattern over and over and over again. That the African man follows the slave code to a T. Like the brainwashing is so thorough, and the culture now is a total slave culture. You also saw this, you remember that other story whereby there was this Kenyan man again who was being beaten up by his Chinese boss in some restaurant in Nairobi. Do you remember? And he had been beaten up for quite a long time. And the Chinese dude is a small dude. And this guy never defended himself. That tells you something, that the total lack of dignity that the Kenyan man lacks. It's the same reason he would not defend himself, not raise his fist against his master, is the very same reason why you too have a Mzungu name. It's the same reason. The fact that you cannot defend your person from your master is the same reason you cannot defend your spiritual man from the master. That's why you still have a Mzungu name, a slave name that you're very proud of and you hold on tightly to it. It says a lot about your mind that we are talking about you being a slave. You're just a slave. You pretend to be this, but at the end of the day, you're just a slave, and you're living according to the code for slaves, the slave code. And so it is within this context that this guy was being beaten up every day by a Chinese dude. When is the last time you were beaten up as a grown man by anyone? The total lack of dignity. That is what is expected of a Kenyan man. You are expected to be docile, to be weak, never to stand up strong, with your chest out, full of strength. No. You are not supposed to show strength in the presence of the master. You're not supposed to show aggressiveness in the presence of the master. Why? Because the master says that he is God, and he presents himself as God. He says he's superior, and he acts all superior. And all these master races that dominate Kenya, they are masters until you get to the Olympics, and then their masterhood immediately disappears, and the real masters manifest themselves. And so what are the implications of a whole country full of men living according to the slave code? The implications are very serious, because it means that the country can never be independent. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you take all these men who live according to the slave code and you make them into heads of nations, heads of departments, heads of this, of that, running a modern nation with the same attitude, the country stops being independent, because part of the slave code is dependency. You cannot make a decision independent of the master. When in doubt, call the master. So when it comes to foreign policy, Kenya doesn't have an independent foreign policy. The foreign policy in Kenya has been the same way from the 1960s, and it is controlled from basically Washington and London. And the people in charge are only too glad to hand over that control to Washington and London. So whatever they are told to do, they do, because these are the values that you're supposed to follow in a slave society. No independent thought. Independent thought is bad. Dependent thought is good. When you're in doubt, call them Zungu. Don't decide anything. Okay? You want to withdraw from Somalia? You can't. You must first call London and ask London, can I withdraw from Somalia? Because we are taking on heavy casualties and we are not seeing the point of this fight. But you can't make up your mind. No, you have to call London and call Washington. It is them to give you permission to withdraw from Somalia. It's them to give you permission to do this, to do that. Should we aid Zimbabwe, which is under sanctions? No, you're not supposed to show any solidarity with your fellow slaves. Solidarity, you must only show solidarity to the slave master, to the master. So, while Zimbabwe is starving, you do not send help. But you do send flowers to England. You must show your love and devotion every single time. Every once in a while, you send flowers to England. And you never cross your master. So if your master tells you from today on, you are not allowed to talk to the people in Zimbabwe. Do not invite their president to your country, neither visit their country. So what are you supposed to do? You obey the master. So you immediately break all rank with Zimbabwe and you let Zimbabwe suffer alone. So this is the mentality, that the implications of this mentality of docility. And so of all the 54 African countries, no country has bothered to assist Zimbabwe to stabilize its economy. Why? Because the Mzungu said, we are forbidding you to talk to Zimbabwe. And they all fell in line. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? 800 million people just falling in line. No questions asked. Because the brainwashing is deep, and the post-colonial African societies are basically slave societies, which do exactly what they are told with no question. Because the other side of it is that if you begin to ask questions, you'll be accused of being outspoken. And this is not a value that is encouraged. Okay? You're supposed to fall in line. You're not supposed to be outspoken. You're not supposed to be asking all these questions. The other slaves will immediately ask you, who are you to be asking these questions? Who are you? And the minute you raise the issue, they say, oh, you've started those politics of yours. Immediately, they are allergic to those sorts of conversations. They are allergic to those kind of conversations. They're offended deeply. The African man in Kenya doesn't like that. Doesn't like that. You just fall in line and follow the master. That's all you're supposed to do. Just follow the master. Stop all these politics. Just stop all these controversies. Just follow the master. Values of a slave society. And the other way that it afflicts the domestic policy is that whatever the master values becomes valuable. So it is the master who gives value to anything. Therefore, if the master decides today to wear torn clothes, the slave, upon seeing the master wearing torn clothes, immediately it becomes a fashion statement for the slave. And the slave runs out and gets some torn clothes and also wears the torn clothes and is very happy. Whatever he sees the master do, he mimics. He never comes up with anything of his own. Not fashion, not music, not products, nothing. Whatever he produces only has value to the extent to which the master gives its value. So, for example, the people of Kenya usually don't drink coffee, but they produce coffee. Why do they make what they don't consume? Well, because it is valuable for the master. The master values coffee, so they make coffee. They don't make what they like, they make what the master likes. It's very simple. The other thing the master doesn't like is to see industry in Africa, and Kenya in particular. The master doesn't want to see you, making your own cars. No. So what does the slave society do? The slave society does everything not to make anything. They want to receive from the hands of the master everything that they have. So every value that the slave society has is the negative value from the master's society. So if the master says, I don't like you being rich, the slave says, I don't like me being rich. The master says, I don't like you building weapons. This is called nuclear proliferation. We don't like it when you try to build yourself nuclear weapons like us. So what does the slave society say? I don't like having weapons of my own. I don't like having nuclear bombs because this is nuclear proliferation. So I don't want any nuclear bombs. So whatever the master values, the slave also values. So the master can do anything he wants with his slave at any time and with no consequence. So any foreigner can come into Kenya, and once they arrive in Kenya, they are totally free. They're even more free than they are in their own societies, because in this situation, they discover quickly that they are the master. They can get away with anything, any crime, anything. Because the African man has been brought up to never challenge him, to always stand down. And isn't it interesting that when you think about it, do you know it's only 2 African countries that actually fought for independence? I mean, a physical fight. It is Kenya and Algeria. None of these other African countries actually fought for the independence like Kenya and Algeria. Or you may want to bring up about Zimbabwe, don't know, Mozambique. No, we are talking about on their own, because Zimbabwe and Mozambique had examples to follow. It doesn't count because all these societies existed at the same time. So in 1950, war was breaking out in Kenya. It didn't break out in Zimbabwe. It didn't break out in Uganda or in Tanzania. They didn't fight. Or Nigeria, they didn't fight. They were there in 1950. So the only 2 countries that we know that fought for independence is Algeria and Kenya. The rest of the other African countries would not dare raise their finger against the master. So the foreigner can do anything to any man in Kenya. Forget about the women and children. They can do anything to any man. They can beat you up, they can slap you, they can call you and your president monkey. They can take your mines. We've seen foreigners showing up and taking over mines, gold mines, all sorts of mines. They can do anything to you because they know that deep inside yourself, in your heart of hearts, you're a slave, and you will never fight back, and you will never stand for yourself. You'll never stand up for yourself. You'll never stand up for your women, and you'll definitely never stand up for your children, which is why Kenya is a huge destination for pedophiles. They know that you won't defend your babies, so they can come over, and they do come over to rape the children, and you say nothing. And so we have to deal with this mentality, your unwillingness to stand up for yourself, the fact that you're spiritually castrated, you're no longer a man, basically you're a woman. You know, you're very aggressive to other African men, and we see this all the time. We see all sorts of aggression towards other Africans, but you'll never see an African showing aggression towards any foreigner who are regarded as the masters. And so anytime we have tribal clashes, you people slaughter each other with no mercy, and you kill each other for land. But interestingly enough is that in Kericho, there are hundreds, almost millions of acres still owned by the British. But I have never seen the local people who are dispossessed of that land claiming that land, but because it's held by Mzungu, the master. So in a slave society, you're not allowed to raise your voice or your fist against the master. So they skip over all these millions of acres. They go hundreds of kilometers away to attack other Africans fighting for a smaller acreage, because all aggression, anger, hostility, hatred must be for your fellow slave. It can never be towards the master, because the master is God. How do you attack the Mzungu, and then on Sunday go to church and worship him as God. So he has to keep the best land and all the factories and all the big businesses. So this is the mental crisis that the Kenyan man lives in. And we see all the outbreak of violence that you see, in Kenya, especially family violence. Where does it come from? When you see people getting drunk, like I would say almost 20% of the adult males in Kenya are perpetually drunk. That is a form of self-abuse. It's a form of self-hatred. So, and we say violence in society is like depression in a person. Depression is simply anger turned inward. When you're angry at yourself because something happened to you and you could not protect yourself. So you end up being angry at yourself, and sometimes you may want to destroy yourself by killing yourself. So we see this on a national level, whereby the African man is angry at himself because he's not allowed to be angry at the master. And so the result of that anger is incredible family violence and incredible just societal violence. You see it all the time. Mob justice is a lot of anger that is latent anger that is in society that boils over in mob violence. Killing suspects and burning them up and attacking each other, attacking your kids, attacking your families, because you feel violated by the system, but you cannot express your anger against the system because that would mean you're going against the master, and you're not allowed to say anything against the master, because the master is also God to you. The Mzungu is not only your master, he's also your God. He's also your angel. He's also the saints of God. And you believe that. It's ridiculous. And you believe that. In the other context of Somalia, why are they killing each other so much? It's the same anger turned inward. What are they so angry about? It's because, because someone showed up on a camel and told them that the only way to enter heaven is to kill yourselves. And they believe that. And some dude shows up on a camel and gives you a story of the way he's in control of the road to heaven. When you're dealing with African men, you have to wonder about the IQ. You have to wonder about the IQ. Yeah, so generally, we need to talk about this slave mentality. It's 2021. It's time it ended. It's time to grow up. You have to grow up. It's time to grow up. How long are you going to worship foreigners and call them God? How can foreigners be God? Come on. The only gods that have ever existed on this planet are Africans. There are no other gods. It's time to grow up. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment below. Kenya's time has come. Our time has come. Your time has come. A time to succeed and not fail. A time to grow wealth and not poverty. A time to go up and not down. It's time for you to stop walking and drive your car. Stop renting and buy yourself a house. It's your time to get blessed. Join the CCV movement, and together let us kick poverty and unemployment out of Kenya. Become a member today. Donate what you can. And remember that the CCV is the only political organization in Kenya that is squarely built upon Christian values, unlike the rest. We'll see you next time. Thank you.